Welcome to CivilNet. My guest today is Jillian C, who is the International Freedom of Expression Director for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. That's a whole lot of responsibility and a fascinating look at internet issues, positive and negative, in this century. Jillian, thank you for joining us on CivilNet.
Sure, thank you for having me.
Jillian, you're in Amsterdam now, but you're usually based in San Francisco?
Yes, that's correct.
And you were lucky enough to be in Baku the beginning of November at the UN-backed Internet Forum in Azerbaijan. And as you know, that raised a lot of noise around the world because on the one hand, internet is supposed to be, expected to be the arena that's open, free, freedom of expression, accessible. And on the other hand, you were in Azerbaijan, which is not known for freedom of expression. Did that make the forum more effective, less effective? What was your experience?
So I would say less effective. You know, it was my first internet governance forum. It's a sort of platform that's been around for a few years now, and was preceded by other forums. And it kind of has a problematic history. Now, the last couple were held in much more open countries. I think last year it was in Nairobi. The year before that in Vilnius. But the year before that, it was in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and that was another controversial location to host it. And there were a number of issues that arose then around, censoring people at the forum itself. And this had also happened at a prior forum in 2005 in Tunisia. And so, looking at this year, I think people were ready and expected these problems to arise, and they did. There were cases of European government officials. Computers being hacked is my understanding of how it happened. And of course, bloggers, local bloggers who were prohibited from entering the forum, all sorts of issues like that. And, like I said, I think that we expected them, but it was nonetheless still frustrating and also frustrating for those of us who don't necessarily understand how the country selection on these things happens. So it was a bit of a challenge.
And I assume, as you said, I mean, not all of that could have been unexpected. Was the hope that somehow by holding it there would at least be this window of openness? I mean, otherwise, I can't explain that.
Yes, no, exactly. I think that's exactly why, these countries kind of put themselves forward in that way. I don't know as much about Azerbaijan as I do about Egypt, so it's hard for me to kind of ruminate on why that particular government would have that interest or what, where they stand. I mean, I understand where they stand on free expression, unfortunately, but I think that, in this case, it seems to me like a country that's trying to assert itself in certain spheres, and this is one way for it to do so. But unfortunately, Azerbaijan doesn't appear to have made any real changes from the forum. Rather, it seems more of a way of sort of apologizing for their behavior towards speech.
In countries like Armenia, where on the one hand we want to believe we're moving towards a more perfect democracy from this imperfect state, and on the other hand, we still have a lot of the Soviet holdovers believing that government can see everything we do and follow everything we do. Does the internet make that real? Do we really need to worry about government surveillance? If they want to, they really can, can't they?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that, I think in a lot of cases, governments and the producers of surveillance technology are one step ahead of the citizenry. One of the things that I think is really important that that gets overlooked is we think about these sort of reactive measures to surveillance, to censorship, these, whether they be policy or technology responses. But what I think is really important is to start from a more basic point of view, which is to say, I think that we need to think about online security from the day we go online. And that starts, at a young age these days. We're looking at kids going online and not really having a concept of privacy. And so if you think about it, even outside of the government context, when a 13-year-old goes on Facebook, they're not necessarily thinking about the long-term implications of the photos or the thoughts that they're sharing.
Sure,
and so that that could mean a personal conflict, but it could also mean government surveillance. And I think that we need to educate from a younger age about what it means to protect oneself online.
Is this really something that each of us has to wage on our own? Is this really a me against the government sort of issue? Is there not any are there no lessons learned from the experience in other countries that we here in Armenia can apply, whether it's in terms of policy or simply in terms of, of technological, electronic protection, so that we really do have freedom of expression and are not worried about government surveillance?
Sure. So I think that there's a number of approaches. I mean, some of them are really, like I said, reactive, where we take protective measures to ensure that the government can't surveil what we're doing. But then there are also measures that are more focused on changing policy from the beginning. And so if you want to look at a great example of that, unfortunately, it's not a perfect example, but in Brazil, there was recently an initiative called the Marco Civil, which was meant to sort of provide a bill of rights for internet users. Some of the best provisions of that were unfortunately scraped from it at the last minute, and so it was passed in a much weaker version. But I think that as citizens, as policymakers, whatever we may be, I think that we do have the capability to focus on more proactive solutions, both from a policy perspective and from a technology perspective.
So in the case of a country like Azerbaijan, the problem is in your face obvious, but that's not to say that in other countries, from the most sophisticated to countries like Armenia, someplace in the middle, that the problem still doesn't exist.
Oh, sure. I mean, these are problems that, that are cropping up in the West, for example, all the time. One of the things that has frustrated me is, I've actually got a great example from yesterday. I could probably quote from it. There was an opinion piece in a Chinese paper that was making the argument, and this was written in English, but it was making the argument that China, shouldn't be looked down upon by Western countries in terms of its approach to censorship, because these same Western countries that are admonishing China for that are also censoring in some way or another, which is absolutely true. Now, I don't particularly agree with that perspective, because I do think that these are happening at different levels and with different levels of legal protection, but nonetheless, we absolutely have to be concerned. I'm from the US, and there are measures usually related to copyright in my country, but that would have a much broader effect of censorship. In the Netherlands, where I am right now, a lot of those measures are focused on child protection, but go beyond protecting children, again, toward limiting free expression. And so I think that this is a very universal issue, and sometimes it's more difficult to deal with when it's not in your face the way it is in Azerbaijan.
And the last question, you've written an article recently about how Western tech companies are even working with some of the governments in the Arab Middle East against some of their own citizens. And that's something that I suspect happens all over the world. I suspect it's not just in the Middle East.
Absolutely. This is a real problem, and it's coming from Europe, it's coming from the US, and increasingly it's also coming from China. And I think that, from a citizen perspective, from an American perspective, what I want to do is, make sure that the actions of these companies line up with the ideals of my government. And so if the US government is saying, China, Azerbaijan, whatever country, stop censoring, stop conducting surveillance on your citizens, but then American companies are selling the very technology that enables these countries to do that, I feel like that's it's a very critical perspective, and that we need to discourage that. Now, how to go about that is a bit more challenging. There are legal restrictions that could be put into place, but those present a number of challenges. There are actions that shareholders in these companies can take, and that's more of an approach that I think. And then I think that, that I believe in. And then I think that on another level, we need to be looking more toward transparency. So if a company is developing a certain technology and they're exporting it to X country, then they need to disclose that information both to their shareholders and perhaps to the government as well. And that's the approach that my organization has taken.
And to us in the countries that are ending up doing the importing. Does the Electronic Frontier Foundation have specific suggestions that individuals can take in order to protect themselves? Is it something that we can give our listeners a link to?
Yeah, absolutely. It's ssd.eff.org, or it's called the Surveillance Self-Defense Project. And we have put together a number of different suggestions that we're actually in the midst of revising, so we're happy to take feedback on this. We put together a number of suggestions for how people can protect themselves online. And this is, from the very basic level of sort of consumer privacy and individual privacy to issues of government surveillance and such. And so, yeah, I think it's a great project, and there are a lot of useful suggestions in there for even the least tech savvy of internet users.
Thank you. Thank you, Jillian York, who is the International Freedom of Expression Director for the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, and thank you for watching CivilNet.